About a year ago, my mom got really sick. She'd been struggling with kidney issues for a while, and her doctors finally said she'd need a transplant. The problem was, there was no telling how long she'd be on the wait list. It could take years, and she didn't have that kind of time. I felt powerless just watching her get weaker by the day, and I started to get desperate. At first, I tried all the normal things. I talked to her doctors, looked into different hospitals, and even considered moving her to a different state to get on another list. But nothing was moving fast enough. I'm an only child, and I knew I wasn't a match. Neither was anyone else in our small family, and that's when I started looking for alternative options. It started with a Google search, just innocent curiosity at first. I typed in things like how to get a kidney faster or alternative kidney transplants. Of course, I knew about illegal organ trafficking in the back of my mind, but I wasn't actively seeking it out. One night, though, I stumbled onto a forum. It wasn't exactly on the dark web, but it wasn't a mainstream site either. There were people discussing organ trades in countries like India or Pakistan, and how easy it could be if you had the money. That's where the rabbit hole began. I spent hours, late into the night, reading these threads, stories from people who claimed to have gone through with it. Most of the time, they were talking about paying surgeons in foreign countries to speed up the process. Not exactly legal, but not outright criminal either. I was hooked, not even sure what I was looking for, but I just kept reading, night after night. Eventually, someone mentioned a way to cut the middleman out. They hinted at a group that could source organs directly, without needing to go through hospitals or waiting lists. They wouldn't say more on the public forum, but they shared an encrypted link. I didn't think twice about clicking it. That's when I landed on the dark web. I didn't know much about the dark web at the time, only what I'd seen in the news or read online. I knew it was where illegal stuff happened, but this forum looked almost professional. It had sections for all kinds of things: organ trades, medical procedures, and even advice on how to hide large sums of money. It was surreal, like walking into a hospital mixed with a back alley. I found a thread about kidney transplants, and after a few days of reading through it, I got in touch with a guy who called himself Dr. H. He was polite, professional, and told me that he could help my mom get a kidney within a matter of weeks. He said he had contacts all over the world and could acquire organs quickly. He didn't go into specifics, and I didn't ask. I was so focused on helping my mom that I didn't care about the details. We started talking over encrypted emails. Dr. H explained that they would perform the surgery in an undisclosed location, but assured me it was safe and done by professionals. I didn't know what to make of that, but by that point I was in too deep. I just wanted to save my mom. He told me the cost would be $150,000. That was way more than I had, but I figured I could make it work. I sold everything I could, my car, my savings, even took out a loan. My mom didn't know any of this. I didn't tell her what I was doing. Once I wired the money, everything moved fast. Dr. H gave me a date and told me they'd take care of everything. I just needed to bring my mom to the agreed-upon location. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I had this gnawing feeling in my gut, but I told myself it was just nerves. The next day, I rented a car and drove my mom to a place just outside of Philadelphia. It was an old, run-down building on the outskirts of town. It didn't look like a hospital, but it was quiet, and there weren't any people around. We walked in, and a man in scrubs met us at the door. He didn't look like a doctor, but he led us down a series of hallways until we got to a small, sterile room. There was a surgical bed in the middle of the room, and it looked like they were ready for us. The whole time, my mom didn't ask any questions. She was so weak by then that I think she just trusted me. I still hate myself for that. They gave her something to make her sleep, and the last thing I remember was watching her drift off as the surgeons started prepping her for the operation. One of them told me to wait outside, and that was it. I sat in a cold, dimly lit waiting room for hours. I don't even know how long it was. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to someone shaking me. It was the same man from before. He told me it was done, and I could see my mom, When I went back into the room, she was lying there, still unconscious but breathing. They told me she'd wake up soon and that everything had gone well. I asked if I could talk to the doctor, but they said he was already gone. They didn't give me any paperwork, no discharge instructions, just told me to take her home and keep an eye on her. We drove back to our house in silence. My mom was still out of it, groggy and weak. Over the next few days, she started to recover, or so I thought. She was able to eat and her energy seemed a little better, but something was off. She started having weird symptoms, dizziness, sharp pains, and at one point she couldn't stop throwing up. I tried calling Dr. H, but his email was dead and the website I'd found him on had vanished. I panicked and took my mom to the ER. I had to lie and say she'd had surgery overseas because I didn't want them to know what I'd done. The doctors ran some tests, and that's when they gave me the news that crushed me. My mom hadn't just received a kidney transplant. She was missing multiple organs. The doctors couldn't even believe it at first. They said it looked like whoever had performed the surgery had taken more than just a kidney. They'd removed part of her liver, her spleen, and even some tissue from her pancreas. The doctors said they didn't understand how she was still alive, but they told me she needed immediate surgery to try and fix the damage. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there numb. I couldn't tell them the truth. I couldn't admit that I'd brought her to some underground clinic, trusting strangers with her life. I just nodded and signed the forms, letting them wheel her away. They managed to stabilize her, but she was never the same. Her body had been through too much. She needed dialysis and her immune system was shot. She had to stay in the hospital for months afterward, and I visited her every day, sitting by her bedside, trying to ignore the guilt that was eating me alive. I tried to track down Dr. H, but he was a ghost. I even went back to that building outside Philadelphia, but it was abandoned. The place was empty, and no one in the area knew anything about it. It was like it had never existed. The police never got involved because I didn't know what to tell them. I didn't want to admit what I'd done, and I knew they wouldn't believe me anyway. So I kept it to myself, carrying the weight of what I'd done alone. I watched my mom's health continue to decline, and every time I looked at her, I was reminded of my mistake. It's been almost a year since that day, and my mom is still hanging on, but just barely. She's in and out of the hospital, and her quality of life is practically non-existent. I don't know how long she has left, and I try not to think about it too much. Every time I see her, I'm reminded of the choices I made, and I wish I could take it all back. Looking back, I know I should have been more careful. I should have asked more questions, done more research, but at the time I was just desperate. I wanted to save her, and in the process, I put her in even more danger. I'll never forgive myself for that. A few months ago, I made a huge mistake. I'm still dealing with it, and honestly, I don't think I'll ever be the same again. I don't know why I'm posting this. Maybe just to get it out of my head. Or maybe as a warning for anyone else who might be dumb enough to do what I did. It all started when I was in college. I'm not going to say where, but it's a big university, the kind you've probably heard of if you follow football or anything like that. I was a pretty average student, not particularly involved in anything. My grades were okay, I had a few close friends, and like most people, I spent way too much time online. One night I was hanging out in my dorm, bored out of my mind. My roommate was out, and I'd already scrolled through every app on my phone at least 10 times. I remember I had some assignments to work on, but like usual, I wasn't in the mood. I ended up browsing Reddit like always, and stumbled across a thread about weird corners of the internet. It wasn't anything too creepy at first, just stuff about abandoned websites, old internet lore, that kind of thing. But then, someone mentioned the dark web. I'd heard of it before, obviously. Everyone's heard of the dark web, and it's always associated with illegal stuff. I'd never thought to check it out, but now that I had nothing better to do, I got curious. So, like any idiot, I started Googling how to access it. Within about 20 minutes, I downloaded the Tor browser, found some links, and started poking around. At first, it was just boring. A lot of dead links, scam sites, and message boards that didn't make any sense. I was about to call it a night when I found this forum that caught my eye. It wasn't flashy or anything, just a basic message board, but the name of it stuck out. The Roulette Game. The description was vague, something about a game where you could win by finding information. I'm into puzzles and that kind of stuff, so I clicked on it. The first thing I noticed was how serious everyone seemed to be. There were threads with people posting about their scores and how they'd won, but no one ever explained what the game actually was. It was all just inside jokes and cryptic comments. After reading through a few threads, I finally found one that spelled it out. The game was called Doxxing Roulette. If you don't know, doxing is when someone finds and publicly posts private information about you. Stuff like your real name, address, phone number, anything that can be used to identify you. It's usually done to harass or intimidate people, but these guys were doing it for fun. The whole game revolved around finding random people online, digging up as much personal info about them as possible, and then sharing it on the forum. The more sensitive the information, the more points you got. I know it sounds messed up, and it was, but at the time it didn't seem real. The posts didn't mention any specific people, just usernames and vague details. The idea of it being some kind of sick game was so absurd that I kept reading, not really thinking much of it. And then I saw a post that changed everything. Someone had shared the info of a guy who went to my university. I recognized the name and even remembered seeing him around campus. The guy wasn't someone I knew personally, just another student, but seeing his phone number, address, and even his bank account details out in the open like that freaked me out. There were comments underneath about how they'd found his social security number and medical history too. I couldn't believe it. It was like watching a car crash. You know it's horrible, but you can't look away. I was glued to the screen, scrolling through the comments as people added more and more details about this guy's life. Someone even posted pictures of his dorm, his class schedule, and messages he'd sent on social media. It was insane how much they'd uncovered. At that point, I should have closed the browser and walked away. But I didn't. I was too curious, too hooked. I kept wondering how they were able to dig up so much info on someone who, as far as I knew, had done nothing to deserve it. And part of me, a really dark part I didn't know existed, wanted to see if I could do it too. I didn't jump in right away. I kept lurking, reading posts, and watching as people played the game. They didn't just target random people either. Sometimes they went after well-known YouTubers, minor celebrities, or politicians. It was always done anonymously, but the level of detail was terrifying. One guy bragged about getting into someone's health records and finding out they had cancer before their family even knew. A week or two went by and I kept going back to that forum every night. I never posted anything, just watched. But the more I saw, the more I started to feel like I understood how they were doing it. It was all about digging through public records, old social media accounts, stuff most people forget they even posted. And once you found one piece of the puzzle, everything else fell into place. One night, after way too many hours online, I decided to try it. I wasn't planning on doxing anyone, not for real, but I wanted to see if I could find anything on a random person. I picked someone I knew from one of my classes, a guy I'd spoken to a few times but wasn't close with. I thought it'd be harmless, just a little test to see if I could figure out how it worked. It started off easy enough. I found his Facebook profile, which was public, and from there I got his phone number and the town he grew up in. I felt a weird rush, like I was solving a puzzle. I kept digging, finding old posts from when he was in high school, some photos tagged by friends, and before I knew it, I had his home address and the names of his family members. I stopped there. I wasn't going to post it anywhere or even tell anyone what I'd found. But still, the fact that I'd done it so easily made me feel off. I couldn't shake this weird mix of pride and disgust. I went to bed that night, telling myself I wouldn't go back to the forum. A few days passed, and everything seemed normal. I was back to my regular routine, going to classes and hanging out with friends. I hadn't touched the dark web or looked at the forum again, but that feeling lingered, like I'd crossed a line I shouldn't have. And then one afternoon, I got an email. It was from an anonymous address, something random. I almost deleted it without opening it, but the subject line made me pause. It just said, "Your turn." I opened it, and my stomach dropped. The email was short, but it had all of my personal info. My full name, my phone number, my home address, even my social security number. There were screenshots of my social media accounts, photos I'd posted years ago, stuff I didn't even remember. It felt like someone had stripped me naked and was holding all the pieces of my life in their hands. I sat there staring at the screen, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I thought about going to the police, but what would I even tell them? That I'd been browsing the dark web, playing around with something I didn't understand. I felt sick. A few minutes later, another email came in. This one had a link to the same forum I'd been lurking on. I clicked it, and there it was, a post with my username. They'd started a new thread, and people were already commenting, adding more and more details about me. One of them had somehow found my class schedule. Another had posted photos of my dorm room. I couldn't believe how fast it was happening. Panic set in. I tried to delete my social media accounts, but it was too late. Everything was already out there. I spent hours that night trying to find a way to take the post down, but there was no way to contact the admins, no way to delete anything. It was like I was trapped. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of missed calls and texts from numbers I didn't recognize. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages, most of them from people I'd never met, calling me names, making threats, asking for money. It was a nightmare. I stopped going to classes, barely left my dorm. I was afraid to even check my email or answer the phone. Every time I did, there was something worse waiting for me. People had found out where my parents lived, where my little sister went to school. They were sending them messages too, threatening them, telling them to watch their backs. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to shut off my phone, delete everything, and just hide. But no matter what I did, the information kept spreading. It felt like the whole internet was against me, and I had no idea how to stop it. I considered going to the school, telling them what was happening, but I was too ashamed. I couldn't admit that I'd been part of something so stupid and dangerous. I didn't want them to know I'd brought this on myself. I felt completely alone. The worst part was that I knew the people on the forum weren't going to stop. They'd made it clear that this was just the beginning. One night, I got a message from a random number with a photo of my dorm building, taken from the street. They knew where I lived, and they were watching. That was the final straw. I packed up a bag and left campus, went back to my parents' house, and stayed there for a few weeks. I didn't tell them the whole story, just said I needed a break from school. I tried to lay low, avoid the internet, and hoped that the storm would pass. I'm still at my parents' house, and nothing has happened since. About a year ago, my life took a turn I never expected. I've played video games my whole life. I'm not saying I was ever pro-level or anything, but I was good enough to hold my own. Over the years, gaming became more than just a hobby. It was a way to escape from the stress of real life. I was really into competitive games, especially first-person shooters like Call of Duty and Rainbow Six Siege. I spent hours playing every day after work, and eventually I started streaming on Twitch. I wasn't making any real money from it, but it was fun, and I had a small group of followers. It felt good to be a part of something, even if it was just a virtual community. But with the way things were going financially in real life, job cuts, rent getting harder to cover, I started to think about how I could make more money. That's when I made a mistake that would haunt me. I'd heard about the dark web, of course, everyone has, but I'd never really thought about using it. That is, until one night when I came across a post on a forum for competitive gamers. The post wasn't about gaming tips or strategies. It was about a group that offered cash prizes for completing real-life challenges. The guy who posted it was pretty vague, but he mentioned something about how the challenges escalated, how only the best players could finish them, and how there was serious money involved. At first, I thought it was a joke or some kind of scam, but curiosity got the better of me. After all, I wasn't making much from streaming, and my regular job wasn't enough to get ahead. I figured it wouldn't hurt to look into it. So I followed the links provided in the post, downloaded the Tor browser, and found the site. It was buried deep in the dark web, and it took a while to figure out how to navigate. Once I finally got to the main page, I saw a list of challenges with dollar amounts next to each one. It wasn't the kind of money you could ignore. We're talking thousands of dollars for simple tasks. The challenges started off easy enough. Small things like sneaking into a building after hours and taking a picture, or pulling off harmless pranks in public places. I told myself it was like some kind of extreme scavenger hunt. It didn't seem like anything too serious at first. Some of the people in the forums even joked about it, calling it IRL gaming. I figured, why not? I could use the cash and it'd be fun to get out of my comfort zone a little. So I signed up and completed the first task. It was simple. Sneak into a grocery store after hours and take a picture of myself in front of the meat counter. I know, it sounds dumb, but I did it. No problem. Within 24 hours, I had $500 in Bitcoin sent to a wallet they provided. I was hooked. The next few tasks were more or less the same: minor break-ins, vandalism, stuff that seemed more like a nuisance than anything really dangerous. Every time I completed a task, I got paid, and the payouts kept increasing. By the time I hit my 5th task, I'd made over $5,000, more than I made in 2 months at my job. I told myself I was just playing a game, that it was harmless, that no one was getting hurt. But that all changed with the next task. The message I got was different this time. Instead of a simple challenge, it was more direct. They wanted me to break into a government building, specifically a small-town courthouse just outside of Pittsburgh. The instructions were to get inside, plant a USB drive they'd provided into one of the computers in the main office, and leave without getting caught. I hesitated. This was no longer a game. It was clearly illegal, and I had no idea what was on that USB drive. But the reward was $10,000. I kept telling myself that no one was going to get hurt, that I wasn't doing anything violent, just planting a piece of hardware, so I agreed. The night of the task, I drove out to this little courthouse. It was in the middle of nowhere with no security other than some cameras and an old fence. I had a cheap ski mask and gloves with me just in case, but I didn't think I'd need them. The plan was simple. Get in through a back window, find a computer in one of the offices, plug in the drive, and get out. The hardest part was getting past the cameras, but once I was inside, it was eerily easy. The building was empty and I didn't see a single person the whole time. I plugged in the USB, waited for a few seconds while the computer made some noises, and then I was out of there. The next day I got paid as usual, and I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. A few days later, I started getting weird messages. They weren't from the group I was working for, but from some anonymous account on one of my regular gaming forums. At first, the messages were cryptic, just random comments like, "Nice work," or "I see you've been busy." I ignored them, figuring it was just some troll who'd seen my streams. But the messages kept coming, and they started getting more personal. The person knew details about my life, things I'd never shared online. They knew where I lived, where I worked, and even mentioned specific people in my life, my friends, my family. I started to freak out. I thought about going to the police, but what was I going to tell them? That I'd been working for some group on the dark web doing illegal stuff for money? I figured the less attention I drew, the better. I stopped logging into the forum, and I stopped doing the tasks. I thought if I just laid low, they'd forget about me. That's when things got worse. One night I was home alone, playing games like usual, when I heard a noise outside my apartment. At first I thought it was just someone in the hallway, but then I realized it was coming from my fire escape. I lived on the 2nd floor, and there was no reason for anyone to be out there. I muted my game and listened, and that's when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, right outside my window. I don't know why, but I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I waited a few more minutes before finally getting up the nerve to check the window. There was no one there. I figured it was just my imagination, or maybe some drunk neighbor stumbling around outside. But the next morning, when I went outside, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a note taped to my door. It was handwritten, just a few words, but it was enough to send me into a panic. The note said, "You're not done." I tore the note down and threw it in the trash, hoping that would be the end of it. But the next day, another note appeared, this time inside my mailbox. It said the same thing. "You're not done." I knew then that whoever was behind this wasn't going to leave me alone. I was in too deep, and they weren't going to let me walk away. I thought about leaving town, maybe going to stay with a friend or family member, but I had no idea if that would even help. These people clearly knew everything about me, and there was no telling how far they'd go. That night, I got another message. This time, it was from the group I'd been working for. They sent me another task, but this one was different. They wanted me to frame someone for a crime. The instructions were clear. I was supposed to plant evidence at the home of someone I knew, a friend of mine from college. They wanted me to break into his apartment, plant drugs and some forged documents they'd provided, and make sure the police got tipped off. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was no longer some stupid scavenger hunt. This was real, and it was crossing a line I never thought I'd have to deal with. I had no idea why they were targeting my friend, and I didn't want to know. But they made it clear that if I didn't do it, they'd come after me next. I felt trapped. I didn't want to hurt my friend, but I didn't see any way out. I couldn't go to the police, couldn't tell anyone what was going on. So I decided to do the only thing I could think of. I went to my friend and told him everything. I didn't give him all the details, just enough to make him understand that he needed to leave town, at least for a while. He didn't ask too many questions, just packed a bag and left that night. I don't know where he went, and I didn't want to know. The less I knew, the better. After he was gone, I sent a message back to the group, telling them that the task was done. I figured they'd find out eventually that I hadn't actually framed my friend, but at least I'd bought myself some time. That was a few months ago, and I haven't heard from them since. But I know it's not over. Every day, I wake up expecting another message, another knock on the door. I don't know what they want from me or why they picked me in the first place. All I know is that I'm stuck, trapped in a game I never wanted to play, and I don't know how to get out. I've tried to go back to my normal life, but nothing feels normal anymore. Every time I hear a noise outside, I'm on edge. Every time I check my phone, I expect to see another message. I don't sleep much anymore, and when I do, I have nightmares about what's coming next. A few months ago, something happened to me that I can't really talk to anyone about. I run a small business, a local print shop here in Chicago. It's not glamorous, but it's mine. And for a while, things were going well. I had a steady flow of customers, enough to keep the bills paid and a little extra to save for emergencies. But like most small businesses, we got hit hard during the pandemic, and things never really bounced back to where they were before. I had to downsize, let a couple of people go, and started doing a lot more of the work myself to keep things afloat. It wasn't just work stress, though. I was also juggling stuff at home. I've got a wife and 2 kids, and even though we live in a decent part of the city, things haven't been feeling as safe lately. There's been an uptick in crime and some weird stuff happening in the neighborhood. Nothing major, just a few break-ins and some people seeing strangers around the alleys at night. Still, I couldn't help but feel like I needed to keep an extra eye on things, so we installed some security cameras around the house, one covering the front door, one in the backyard, and another at the side gate. That's where all of this starts. I've never been a tech guy, but setting up the cameras wasn't too hard. Everything was connected through a home network, and I could monitor the live feed through an app on my phone. It gave me some peace of mind knowing I could check in anytime, especially when I was at work and my family was home. The cameras weren't anything fancy, just basic security stuff that records when there's motion and sends an alert to your phone. But after we got them up and running, I started feeling better, like maybe we could stop worrying so much about the random stuff happening around the neighborhood. Then one day, out of the blue, my computer at the shop froze while I was working on an order. At first, I thought it was just some regular tech issue, Maybe the machine was overloaded. Maybe I needed to reboot. But when I tried restarting it, a message popped up on the screen. One of those black boxes with red text you see in movies. It said my files had been encrypted and that I had to pay a ransom in Bitcoin if I wanted to get my data back. I knew what it was right away: ransomware. I'd heard about this kind of thing happening to businesses, but I always thought it was something that happened to big companies, not to small shops like mine. I wasn't exactly sitting on some huge database of valuable information, just customer orders, invoices, and designs. But there it was, my whole system locked, and they wanted money to give it back. I'll be honest, I panicked. I tried everything I could think of to fix it, Googling solutions, calling up a few IT guys I knew. Nothing worked. The whole system was completely locked down. Every attempt to access anything just led back to the ransom message. I didn't know what to do. That night I got an email. It was from the people who had hacked me, I guess. They didn't introduce themselves, just laid out their demands. They wanted $10,000 in Bitcoin. I didn't have anywhere near that kind of money lying around. The email gave me a deadline of 48 hours. If I didn't pay, they said they'd wipe everything and I'd lose all my files forever. And as if that wasn't enough, they mentioned they knew I had a family and that I shouldn't do anything stupid like go to the police. At first, I thought that was just a scare tactic, something they say to freak you out and get you to pay faster. I wasn't planning on going to the cops anyway. I figured they wouldn't be able to help. But that part about my family stuck with me. How did they know I had a family? My heart was pounding as I tried to figure out if I'd ever mentioned anything personal online or in an email that someone could use against me. I couldn't think of anything. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I got. But I was too busy dealing with the business stuff to dwell on it. I had customers to worry about, deadlines to meet, and all of my files were still locked. The next morning, I was working at the shop, trying to figure out how to come up with the money, when I got an alert on my phone. It was from the home security app. The camera in my backyard had detected motion. I opened the app, expecting to see maybe a stray cat or something, but what I saw made my stomach drop. It was live footage of my family in the backyard. My wife and the kids were playing, totally unaware that the camera was even on. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it sooner, but something felt off about the way the footage was showing up. I could see everything from a weird angle, like someone was controlling the camera remotely. The feed was moving slightly, panning back and forth, zooming in and out. I hadn't touched it. I wasn't controlling it. And then another email came in. It was from the same people who had sent the ransom demand. This time, there was no talk about the files. The message was short, just a few sentences. "We're watching. Pay up or things will get worse." There was a screenshot attached, a freeze frame from the live feed of my backyard. My kids blurred slightly in motion, my wife laughing as they played. I felt sick. This was real. They weren't just messing with my business, they were watching my family. The cameras I'd installed to keep us safe were being used against me. I didn't know what to do. I tried disconnecting the cameras, but nothing seemed to work. Every time I checked the app, the feed was still there, like they had taken full control of the system. I tried calling the company that made the cameras, but they couldn't offer any real help. They told me to reset the system, but it didn't do anything. It was like whoever was behind this had completely taken over. I started checking the house constantly, looking for any sign that someone had been there. Every little sound made me jump, and I found myself locking and relocking the doors, checking the windows obsessively. My wife noticed, of course. I couldn't hide my paranoia, but I didn't tell her what was going on. I couldn't. What was I supposed to say? That some faceless person on the internet was watching us through our own cameras? The deadline for the ransom was approaching, and I hadn't come up with a plan. I wasn't going to pay them, not after what they did, but I had no idea how to make it stop. And then the final email came. This one was worse than the others. There was no ransom demand this time, no threats, no deadlines, just a video. I clicked on it, and my heart dropped. It was footage of my house at night, the camera pointed at the front door. I watched as someone walked up to the door, stood there for a moment, and then walked away. I couldn't see the person's face. They were wearing a hoodie, head down, moving quickly. But they had been there, right outside my house, while we were all inside, asleep. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after that. I stayed up, pacing, checking the cameras, trying to figure out how they had gotten control, how they knew so much about me. I felt like I was losing my mind, like no matter what I did, they were always one step ahead. I wanted to call the police, but every time I picked up the phone, I hesitated. I kept thinking about that first email, the part where they said they knew about my family. I didn't want to do anything that might make them act on their threats. For days I lived like that, barely eating, barely sleeping, just waiting for the next message, the next video, the next sign that they were still watching. But then, nothing. The emails stopped. The videos stopped. The camera feeds went back to normal. I kept waiting for something else to happen, for another threat or demand, but it never came. I don't know if they're really gone. I don't know if they got bored, if they moved on to someone else, or if they're just waiting for the right moment to strike again. The files on my computer are still locked, and I've given up trying to get them back. At this point, I don't care about the business. I just want my family to be safe. About 6 months ago, something happened that I haven't been able to talk about until now. I've tried to forget it, to pretend like it didn't happen, but it's always there in the back of my mind. I can't tell anyone I know in real life, so this post is my way of trying to get it out. Maybe if I write it down, it'll stop haunting me the way it has. It started like most of my nights do, with boredom. I was a senior in high school, coasting through the last few months before graduation, and I didn't have much to do. I'm not a party guy, never really got into sports or any of the stuff my friends were into, so most of my free time was spent online. I was always messing around with random sites, jumping from Reddit to YouTube to whatever weird corner of the internet I could find. You know, the usual stuff when you're bored out of your mind. One night I stumbled onto a thread about dark web horror stories. At first it was kind of entertaining in a creepy way. People were sharing stories about messed up sites they found, weird videos, all that kind of stuff. Most of it seemed like urban legend nonsense, but it was enough to keep me reading. Someone mentioned a dark website where you could pay to watch live entertainment. They didn't say much about it, just that it was disturbing and not for the faint of heart. I wasn't planning on finding it or anything. I mean, I knew about the dark web, but had never actually thought about going there. It always seemed like something you'd hear about on the news but never encounter yourself. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I started Googling around, trying to figure out if the site was real or just another internet myth. It took me a couple of days, but eventually, I figured out how to access the dark web using Tor. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just poking around to see what was out there. Most of it was the usual illegal stuff you hear about: drugs, stolen credit cards, counterfeit IDs. It was sketchy, but not as terrifying as I'd expected. And then, after clicking through a few links, I found something. The site had a plain black background with a single line of text in the middle. Live entertainment, join the chat room. Below it was a login button. There wasn't much to go on, and it didn't exactly scream legitimacy, but again, I was curious. So I created an account using a throwaway email and clicked join. When the chat room opened, the first thing I noticed was how active it was. There were dozens of people posting constantly, like the site was buzzing with energy. But it wasn't the kind of chat you'd expect on a regular streaming platform. The messages were cold, clinical. People were placing bids, asking for tasks to be done, but it wasn't clear what those tasks were. There were no usernames, just a bunch of anonymous posts scrolling by faster than I could keep up with. Then the video feed appeared. At first, I thought it was a prank. The stream showed a dark, empty room like a basement or a storage unit, with a single chair in the center. The camera quality wasn't great, and the room was barely lit by a flickering light bulb. There was nothing going on, no sound, just this eerie, still image. I kept watching, waiting for something to happen, thinking maybe it was some kind of horror ARG. But then the chat started to get more active. People were bidding again, typing out numbers and requests. And then the door in the video opened. A man walked in, dragging someone behind him. The person was tied to the chair, their hands bound, and a hood over their head. At first I thought it was staged, like a cheap horror movie setup. But there was something about the way the person struggled that made it feel way too real. I could see their body shaking, hear muffled sounds coming from beneath the hood. The man said nothing, just left the person tied up and walked out of the frame. The chat exploded with bids. People were posting numbers, making suggestions for what they wanted to see next. My heart was pounding, but I was still in denial. I kept thinking, this has to be fake. There's no way this is real. But deep down, I knew something was off. The energy in the chat was too intense, too cruel. These people weren't watching a show. They were directing it. Suddenly, a new message appeared in the chat. Task accepted. I watched in horror as the man came back into the room holding a baseball bat. He stood in front of the person tied to the chair, just staring at them for what felt like forever. The chat kept scrolling, with people typing faster and faster, urging him to do something. I couldn't look away. It was like I was glued to the screen, paralyzed. Then he swung the bat. The sound it made when it connected was sickening. The person's body jolted in the chair, their screams muffled by the hood. Blood started dripping onto the floor and the chat went wild. People were typing out more requests, bidding higher and higher for different acts of violence. I felt like I was going to throw up, but I still couldn't bring myself to close the browser. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in real time. I finally forced myself to click out of the window, but the damage was done. I sat there in silence, staring at my screen, trying to process what I had just seen. My hands were shaking and I felt like I couldn't breathe. It was one thing to read about dark web horror stories, but it was something else entirely to see it for yourself. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of that room, that chair, the blood. I kept thinking about the person tied up, wondering who they were, how they had ended up there, if they were still alive. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what could they do about it? It wasn't like I knew where this was happening or who was behind it. The next day, I tried to go back to my normal routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line. I had seen something that I wasn't supposed to see, something I could never unsee. I couldn't concentrate on anything. My mind kept replaying the video, the sound of the bat, the person's muffled screams. A few days later, I got an email. It was from an anonymous address, and the subject line just said, "Thanks for watching." My stomach dropped as I opened it. The email was short, just a few lines of text, but it was enough to send me into a full-blown panic. They knew my IP address, my location, and even my real name. The message was clear. I had been seen, and they knew exactly who I was. I deleted the email immediately, but it didn't matter. I knew they had the information. I unplugged my computer, wiped the hard drive, and even switched internet providers. But I couldn't shake the fear that they were still watching me, waiting for me to log back in. For weeks, I was paranoid. Every time I heard a noise outside, I thought it was them. Every unknown number that called my phone made my heart race. I couldn't focus at school, couldn't hang out with my friends without feeling like something terrible was about to happen. I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next message, the next sign that they were still out there, watching me. Eventually, the fear faded a little. Nothing happened. No one showed up at my door, no more emails, no more threats. But the damage was already done. I can't go back to the way things were before. I've tried to explain it to myself a million different ways. Maybe it was all fake, maybe it was just a sick prank, maybe I wasn't actually in any danger. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. I don't go online much anymore. I deleted all my social media, stopped gaming, stopped browsing forums. I just can't shake the feeling that the internet isn't as safe as we all think it is, that there are dark corners out there where people do things no one should ever see. I don't know what happened to the person in that video. I don't even know if they're still alive, but I can't stop thinking about them, about the moment their life was sold to the highest bidder. And I can't help but wonder how many other people have stumbled onto that site, how many others are still watching, placing bids, directing the horror from the safety of their keyboards. About a year ago, I made a decision that completely wrecked my life. I'm a programmer, a decent one at that. I've been into hacking since I was a teenager, but never anything serious, just small-time stuff. A few years ago, I started taking freelance gigs, mostly legit, but sometimes a bit shady. Some guys would contact me asking for help with website defacements or breaking into email accounts. I'd take those jobs when I needed extra cash, but I always thought of it as harmless. Nothing really criminal, just messing with people who deserved it. Then last year, I got a message from a guy I didn't know. He contacted me through an encrypted email service, which wasn't unusual, but his request was. He wanted me to carry out a DDoS attack on a small business. Now, I've done DDoS jobs before, but this one was weird. It was a small company, nothing big, and the pay he offered was way more than the job should have been worth. $5,000 in Bitcoin for what amounted to about an hour of work. I figured it was some kind of business rivalry, one company trying to screw over another. It didn't seem like a big deal, and I really needed the money at the time, so I agreed to do it. I set up the attack, directed a botnet at their servers, and within minutes their website was down. Easy money. I sent proof of the attack, got paid, and that was that. Or so I thought. A few days later, I started getting weird messages on my phone. I don't know how they got my number, but the messages were vague at first, like someone was warning me. Things like, "You don't know what you've done," and "They're watching." I brushed it off as some scam or a troll trying to mess with me. I'd been in this world long enough to know when someone was just trying to scare me. I ignored it. But the next week, things got more serious. I came home one night to find a black SUV parked outside my apartment. It didn't have any markings, and the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I wouldn't have thought much of it, but it stayed there all night. The next morning it was gone, but that evening it was back again, just sitting there. This went on for days. It never moved, never followed me, but it was always there when I got home. I started to get paranoid, thinking maybe the guy who hired me was trying to intimidate me, or maybe I'd pissed off the wrong people. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so I started digging into the company I'd taken down. I wanted to know why a simple DDoS attack would lead to this kind of trouble. What I found made my stomach drop. The business wasn't just a regular small company. It was a front for a political organization, one that had ties to several high-profile figures in Washington. The DDoS attack I'd done had crippled their servers at a crucial time, right when they were dealing with sensitive financial information. From what I could gather, the attack had caused massive financial damage, not just to the company, but to the people connected to it. It wasn't just a prank or some harmless sabotage. I'd unwittingly become part of something much bigger, and now I was on the radar of people I had no business messing with. I started getting more messages, this time from the guy who had hired me. He didn't reveal his identity, but his tone had changed. He wasn't just asking for help anymore, he was demanding it. He said if I didn't do what he asked, he would expose my involvement in the DDoS attack. He had everything: logs, IP addresses, proof that I'd carried out the attack. He said if I didn't help him with the next job, he'd leak it all to law enforcement and to the people I'd attacked. I was trapped. I couldn't go to the police. I'd be screwed if they found out what I'd done. But I also couldn't keep working for this guy, whoever he was. I tried to disappear, tried to wipe my tracks and go off the grid, but it was no use. He always found me. He always knew where I was. The next job he asked for was worse. He wanted me to break into a government contractor's network and steal classified documents. I'm not talking about just defacing a website or stealing someone's email. This was serious. This was the kind of thing that could land me in federal prison for life. I didn't know why he wanted the documents, and I didn't ask. I just knew I couldn't refuse. I thought maybe if I did this one job, he'd leave me alone. I was wrong. The hack was complicated. It took weeks of planning, writing custom scripts, testing vulnerabilities. I barely slept during that time, and when I did, I had nightmares about getting caught. But I pulled it off. I got into the network, grabbed the files, and sent them to him. I was hoping that would be the end of it, that he'd let me go once he had what he wanted. A few days later, I got a call. It was from a blocked number, and the voice on the other end was calm, almost friendly. He told me he knew who I was, where I lived, and everything about me. He said he worked for the government, and they'd been monitoring me for weeks. He said they knew about the DDoS attack, about the hack, about everything. I thought I was done. I thought this was it. I was going to prison, but instead, he made me an offer. He told me that they wouldn't arrest me, that they'd let me walk free, if I cooperated. They wanted me to go back to the guy who'd hired me and act like everything was fine, like I was still willing to work for him. But instead of carrying out his next job, I was supposed to report back to them. They wanted to use me as bait, to lure him out into the open. I didn't have a choice. It was either work for them or go to jail. So I agreed. The next few weeks were hell. I was caught between two sides, trying to juggle the demands of the guy who had me in his pocket and the government agents who were watching my every move. Every time I made contact with him, I had to report back to my handler. I was playing a dangerous game, and I knew if either side found out I was double-crossing them, I was dead. I barely left my apartment. I didn't answer calls from friends or family. I couldn't focus on anything but keeping myself alive. The stress was killing me, but I didn't have a way out. I was stuck in the middle of something I didn't understand, something way bigger than me. The worst part was, I didn't even know who I was working for anymore. The guy who hired me never showed his face, never gave a name. And the agents who were supposed to be helping me? I couldn't trust them either. For all I knew, they were just using me until they didn't need me anymore. I felt like a pawn in some game I couldn't even begin to comprehend. And then, one night, everything came crashing down. I was supposed to meet the guy who'd been blackmailing me. For weeks, we'd only communicated online, but this time he wanted to meet in person. He said he had a new job for me, something big. I didn't tell the agents about the meeting. I was too scared. I didn't know if they'd protect me, and I didn't want to take the risk of him finding out I'd been working with the government. The meeting was in a parking garage in downtown Atlanta. I got there early, parked my car, and waited. My heart was pounding and I was sweating through my shirt, but I kept telling myself this would be over soon. I just had to get through this meeting and then maybe I'd figure out a way out of this mess. He showed up a little after midnight wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't say much, just handed me an envelope with the details of the next job. I wanted to ask him why he was doing this, what he wanted from me, but I kept my mouth shut. I just wanted to get out of there. As I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me. It wasn't him. It was someone else. Two men, both dressed in black, walking toward us. The guy I'd been working for froze. He knew what was happening. Before I could say anything, he pulled a gun from his jacket and pointed it at me. I don't know what happened next. Everything was a blur. I remember hearing gunshots, the sound of tires screeching, and then silence. When I came to, I was lying on the ground, bleeding from my shoulder. The guy who'd hired me was gone, and the two men who had been following us were dead. I don't know who they were. I don't know if they were with the government or if they were part of some other group. All I know is that I got lucky that night. I should have been dead, but somehow I walked away. I never heard from the guy who hired me again. I don't know if he's still out there or if he's gone underground, but I can't stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day he shows up again. I'm not working in tech anymore. I've cut myself off from that world. But I know I'll never really be free. About a year ago, I got myself into something I still regret. I was always pretty tech-savvy, the kind of person who likes to poke around where they shouldn't. I'd been interested in the deeper parts of the internet for a while, reading about the dark web, hacking forums, stuff like that. It started off innocent enough, just curiosity. But that curiosity led me somewhere I wish I'd never gone. I'd spent months diving into different forums and hidden sites, mostly just exploring out of boredom. I wasn't doing anything illegal, just lurking. At first, it was the typical stuff you'd expect: drug markets, counterfeit goods, stolen data. It was dark, but I kept telling myself it was just another layer of the internet. The further I went, though, the stranger things got. One night, I came across a site that felt different. It didn't have a flashy name or a big red flag screaming danger, but something about it made me pause. It was called The Network, and it looked like just another forum at first glance. The posts were cryptic, short, and hard to follow unless you knew what you were looking for. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't look away. There were threads about all kinds of things: coded messages, encrypted files, and strange conversations that felt like they were happening between people who knew a lot more than they were letting on. I was intrigued. I wanted to understand what they were talking about, so I kept digging. Hours passed and I started piecing things together, but it still didn't make much sense. That was until I found a thread titled, "We See You." I clicked on it, expecting the same kind of cryptic nonsense I'd been seeing all night. But the post wasn't like the others. It was a single sentence: "You're in now, no going back." Underneath it was a series of numbers that looked like an IP address. At first, I thought it was a scare tactic, just someone trying to mess with new users. But then I noticed something. The numbers were familiar. Too familiar. It was my IP address. My stomach dropped. I checked it again, hoping I'd made a mistake, but there was no mistake. The post was directed at me. I tried to play it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence or some kind of trick. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Someone knew I was there, and they were letting me know they were watching. I closed the browser immediately, shut down my computer, and tried to forget about it. But I couldn't. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to figure out how they'd gotten my information, how they'd known I was on the site. The next morning, I considered wiping my computer, thinking that might help. But I didn't. I convinced myself I was overreacting. That was just the beginning. Over the next few days, little things started happening. My internet would cut out randomly, only for a few seconds at a time, but it was enough to notice. My computer would act strange. Files I didn't remember downloading would appear, and my browser history would show sites I hadn't visited. I ran every antivirus and malware scan I could find, but nothing came up. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, one night, something happened that made it impossible to ignore. I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through emails, when a message popped up on my screen. It wasn't in my inbox. It just appeared as a window in the middle of my desktop. It was plain, just text on a black background, and it said, "We told you we see you." Before I could even react, my internet cut out completely. I stared at the screen, my heart racing, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. I unplugged my router, rebooted my computer, but nothing worked. After about 15 minutes, the internet came back and the message was gone, like it had never been there. I wanted to believe it was just some kind of glitch, maybe someone messing with me through a virus or something. But things got worse after that. The next day, my webcam light started flickering on and off. Even though I never used it, I tried disabling it, even physically covering it with tape, but the light would still flicker. It was as if someone was turning it on remotely, watching me, even when I wasn't online. That's when I knew I had to stop. I deleted every trace of the dark web from my computer, wiped my hard drive, and changed all my passwords. I didn't want anything to do with it anymore. I thought if I stayed offline for a while it would blow over, but it didn't. A few days later, I was walking home from work trying to clear my head when I got a notification on my phone. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short, but it stopped me dead in my tracks. It said, "Turn around." I was on a busy street, people walking past me in every direction, but I couldn't move. My heart was pounding and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to know if someone was actually there. But I had to. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the crowd, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No one was looking at me, no one seemed out of place, but the message had rattled me. I went home, locked the door behind me, and sat in silence for hours, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The messages stopped, the weird things with my computer stopped, and for a while, it seemed like maybe it was over. That peace didn't last long. A couple of weeks later, I was cleaning out some old files on my computer when I found something strange. There was a folder on my desktop that I didn't recognize. It was named Home. I hadn't created it, and I hadn't seen it before. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside were hundreds of photos. Photos of me. They were all taken from different angles, some from inside my apartment, others from outside on the street, at work, even at the grocery store. Some of them were clearly taken through my webcam, while others seemed like they'd been taken with a phone or a camera. The timestamps on the photos went back weeks, maybe even months. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through them. There were photos of me doing everyday things, cooking, watching TV, sitting at my desk. Someone had been watching me for a long time, documenting every part of my life. I slammed my laptop shut, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police. What would I even tell them? That someone had hacked into my life, was watching me 24/7, and had left a folder of proof on my computer? I felt trapped. I tried to forget about it, to go back to living my life like nothing had happened. I kept my webcam covered, started leaving my phone at home whenever I went out, even installed new locks on my door. But it didn't matter. The damage was already done. The photos were proof that someone had been inside my apartment, that they had been close enough to take pictures of me while I was sleeping, while I was going about my daily routine. Every time I left the house, I wondered if someone was following me, watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I started to notice shadows in places I hadn't before, strange faces in crowds that seemed too familiar. I stopped using my computer altogether. I left it unplugged, covered the camera, and even thought about getting rid of it completely. But the photos were still there, on my hard drive, a reminder that someone had been in my life in ways I couldn't control. I couldn't delete them, though. I wanted to, but I couldn't bring myself to get rid of the only proof I had that this nightmare was real. For weeks, nothing happened. No more messages, no more texts, no more strange behavior from my computer. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whoever had been watching me had moved on. But deep down, I knew they were still out there. They had all my information, my address, my habits, my routines. I was exposed, and there was nothing I could do about it. I've been living like this for months now, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if today is the day they'll come back. Every time my phone buzzes, I feel that familiar sense of dread, wondering if it's another message, another reminder that I'm not in control of my own life. I've always been into collecting old, rare things, mostly antiques, vintage watches, old furniture, that kind of stuff. It's not just a hobby for me. I've been doing it for years, long enough to get good at spotting value in what most people would overlook. Some of my favorite pieces I've found at estate sales or auctions, and when I'm lucky, I come across a gem that's been forgotten in someone's attic. It's a thrill, really, finding something unique, something with a story behind it. But what happened a few months ago made me question everything about this hobby. I've never told anyone about this, not even my wife. I'm not sure how I'd even begin to explain it without sounding like I've lost my mind. It started when I was browsing online late at night, on one of those auction sites that specialize in selling rare or stolen goods. It was a dark web marketplace. I'd ended up there after hearing whispers from other collectors about how you could find real treasures if you knew where to look. Most of the stuff on there was just overpriced junk, but sometimes I'd come across something special. That night, I wasn't really looking for anything specific, just scrolling through the listings. And then I saw it. An auction for what looked like personal belongings. It wasn't an ordinary auction. It had a strange title, something like Memories for Sale. There were a few photos of the items, random, personal stuff, a wristwatch, some old photos, a diary, small things like that. At first, it just looked like someone had looted an old house and was trying to make a quick buck off the personal items they'd found. But then, as I scrolled through the pictures, I felt a weird chill. I recognized something. There was an old pocket watch in one of the photos. It looked almost identical to the one my grandfather had passed down to me years ago. The design, the tarnish on the edges, it was too familiar. I clicked through the images and that's when I saw it. Something I couldn't mistake. There was a picture of a small box, about the size of a shoebox, filled with letters, postcards, and a few crumpled photos. I knew those letters. They were mine. They were the same letters I'd written as a kid, the same postcards I'd sent home from camp years ago, the same photos that had been in my childhood home, tucked away in a dusty old drawer. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. It was impossible. No one should have these. These were things that had been in my family's possession for years, items I thought were still packed away in the attic of my childhood home in Milwaukee. I scrolled further down the listing, and my breath caught in my throat. There were more items from my past, old toys, my high school yearbook, even some drawings I'd done as a kid. How had these things ended up here? Who was selling them? The auction didn't have much detail, just a vague description saying that the seller had come into possession of rare and unique personal artifacts. I started to feel sick. I had no idea how these things had ended up online. I hadn't been back to my childhood home in years. My parents had moved out a long time ago and the house had been sold. I assumed all the stuff in the attic had either been thrown out or packed away in storage. But this? How did these personal things end up on a dark web auction? I knew I should have just closed the browser and forgotten about it. But I couldn't. I placed a bid on the auction. I told myself I needed to get those things back, that they didn't belong in someone else's hands. I didn't think I'd actually win. There were already a few bids and the price was getting high, but I figured I'd at least try. A few days later, I got an email. I'd won the auction. The feeling I had when I saw that message wasn't relief. It was dread. I didn't even want the items anymore. I just wanted to forget the whole thing, but now I had to go through with it. I followed the instructions in the email, sent the payment in Bitcoin, and gave them my P.O. box for delivery. The seller promised the items would be shipped within a week. The package arrived much faster than I expected. It was dropped off at my P.O. box just 3 days after I'd sent the payment. It was a plain brown box, sealed up tight with tape. I brought it home, but I couldn't bring myself to open it right away. It sat on my dining room table for the rest of the day and I just stared at it, trying to make sense of how this had happened. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I finally opened it. Inside were all the items I'd seen in the auction photos, my old letters, postcards, toys, and drawings. Everything was there, exactly as I remembered it. But as I started going through the box, something felt wrong. There were more things in there than I'd seen in the photos, things I didn't recognize. There was a small journal, worn and yellowed with age. I flipped through it, but the writing inside wasn't mine. It was someone else's, someone who seemed to know me. The entries were dated and they went back years, detailing things about my life, about my family, about places I'd lived and people I'd known. But none of it was written by me. It was like someone had been watching me for a long time, documenting every detail of my life, even things I'd forgotten. One of the entries described the day I'd broken my arm as a kid. I'd fallen off my bike in front of my house and my mom had rushed me to the hospital. The journal described it in perfect detail, down to the color of the shirt I was wearing. I had no memory of telling anyone about that, and yet here it was, written out like it had been copied from my mind. I kept flipping through the pages, my heart racing as I read more. Whoever had written this journal had been following me for years, writing down every little thing about me. There were entries about my first job, about the day I moved into my college dorm, even about conversations I'd had with my wife when we were dating. I was shaking by the time I got to the end of the journal. The last entry was dated just a few weeks before I'd found the auction. It described the night I'd stayed up late, browsing the dark web, and stumbled across the auction for my own belongings. The last line sent a chill down my spine. "He's found the auction. Let's see what he does next." I slammed the journal shut and shoved it back in the box. I didn't know what to think. Someone had been watching me for years, and I hadn't even known. But why? And how had they gotten their hands on these personal items? I hadn't even realized some of these things were missing. It was like they'd been taken without me ever knowing they were gone. I wanted to throw the whole box out, but I couldn't. I was afraid that whoever had sent it to me was still watching, waiting to see what I'd do. I didn't know what they wanted or what their end game was, but I didn't want to provoke them. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the journal and the auction. I tried to forget about it, to push it out of my mind, but it was always there, lurking in the back of my thoughts. Every time I went online, I felt paranoid, like someone was tracking everything I did. I stopped going to the dark web, deleted all the links I'd saved, and even considered getting rid of my computer entirely. But the damage was already done. A month after I received the package, I came home to find another box waiting for me on my doorstep. This time it wasn't something I'd bid on. There was no return address, no shipping label, just a plain brown box like the last one. I brought it inside, my hands trembling as I opened it. Inside were more of my personal belongings, things that had been in my house just days earlier. My keys, my watch, a few books from my shelf, all things that I hadn't even noticed were missing. There was no note, no explanation, just my stuff, neatly packed up and sent back to me like a twisted game. I checked every door and window, every lock in the house, but there was no sign of a break-in. Whoever had taken these things had done it without leaving a trace. I knew then that they had access to my house, to my life, and I had no idea how to stop them. I haven't received any more packages since then, but I know they're still out there. I know they're still watching. I can feel it every time I leave the house, every time I come home. It's like they're waiting for the right moment to send me the next box, to remind me that my life isn't really mine anymore. I don't know what they want, or why they've chosen me, but I can't escape the feeling that this is far from over.
Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.